So this originally was a 2-hour lecture I gave earlier this summer in Singapore, so I've had to condense it a little bit. It's work based on a joint book that I'm writing with 2 other economists, Guido Tabellini and Avner Greif, and the book will eventually emerge, one hopes. And so, like many of people, I'm starting here with Pomerantz's book, which is now almost 20 years out. And you all know, you've all read it, you know what it's all about and so on. It's been incredibly influential, and it sort of led to a great deal of work, which is the definition of influential, and much of the work that you heard from Leandro and Bishnu and many other people like Jan Leutner, Bob Allen, and on and on. We've been trying to sort of look at Keynes' argument. I don't want to in any way detract from it, although I, like Patrick, have disagreements with the book. But it's mostly about economic divergences. So it's based on whether it's wages or income per capita, either one of those. It's basically when do living standards or GDP per capita or wages in China start to diverge. And as you all know, the California School, of which Ken, when he was living in California, was a member, basically argued that the Industrial Revolution is where all the action was. That until 1750 or so, Europe and China were moving on fairly similar tracks as far as living standards are concerned, and it's only then that the two broke apart. Now that's, I think, and here I'm reproducing, like others before me, the calculations that Steve Broadberry and his team have created. This is a graph that I've made from their 2018 JH paper, and it does. You can interpret it as a great divergence or a big divergence or a small divergence. For me, actually, what this shows more than anything else is perhaps the notion that sort of these grand fundamentalist Malthusian interpretations that Greg Clark and Oded Gallo have been proposing probably don't survive the confrontation with this kind of data, because we do see growth and we see very different levels of income per capita. One striking thing is that Italy already in the Middle Ages has an income per capita that's much higher than almost anybody else, meaning that there must have been above subsistence. Now, China, from this story at least, if you go for it, clearly is very early on way above the European nations, but eventually falls behind. My argument is that this is an interesting story, but it may be not the most interesting story. And if you ever want to get into the reasons why, which were raised here, I think rightly so, you have to look at other divergences. So I'm going to try to get in the little time I have through at least 5 divergences. I have more if you push me on it, but let's see if I get through these 5. And now, I want to say that the word divergence actually I only borrowed because Ken used it. Many of these divergences aren't divergences, they are reversals. And I think that's something to keep in mind. So, the first one, and could it be culture? So David Landis, of course, made a very big deal out of culture in his Wealth and Prosperity of Nations book, and somehow argued quite with a straight face that Chinese culture was incompatible with economic development and technological progress, which every sinologist that I know and many other people basically have found unacceptable. And what's more, a lot of people are reluctant about culture, largely because some version of historical materialism, and not just Marxist one, but also people like Ian Morris, essentially say, look, culture is endogenous, it's the result of other things. Every nation gets the culture that it needs. That's Ian Morris's quote. And so we shouldn't be wasting our time on culture. And I think there's a consensus growing that this sort of culture-free approach of the California School has been misplaced. And I'm going to focus first on the Needham puzzle, which Patrick already mentioned. And of course, Patrick has a wonderful paper published a decade ago in which he speaks of cosmology. He doesn't talk about culture, but I don't know what the difference is between a culture and a cosmology. So we can agree on that. But it isn't really. The Needham puzzle is more than a divergence. It really is a reversal, because in Tang and Song times, China was by any count a technologically sophisticated, literate, commercialized, developed economy at a time when, Europe was a famished, violent, and ignorant backwater. China was governed by a meritocratic bureaucracy. It was very heavily invested in human capital. And yet, the progress of China started to slow down during Ming times. And nobody knows quite how fast, and it's probably uneven regionally and sectorally, but clearly it's not quite what it was before. And, of all the great technological and scientific advances that are listed in the many Needham volumes, it turns out, and Simon Winchester actually in his book, The Man Who Loved China, has a little table of those, very few of them were made after 1200 and none after 1400. And that's actually probably as striking a phenomenon as all the GDP statistics that anybody can amass. And so as a result, it's fair to say that whether you believe in a scientific revolution in Europe or not, China didn't have one. Okay? And the same is true about an industrial revolution. Now, it is very important to keep these are different and separate questions. And they're often mixed up, but I've done made a lot of effort to try to keep them apart. So why? And so let me give you one solution of a paper that isn't all that well known, but I've always thought was totally brilliant. That's Justin Lin's 1995 Economic Development and Cultural Change paper. And in that paper, Justin Lin points out that a sort of technological change can happen in two ways. One of them is sort of experience-based, in which technological change happens through trial and error, through cumulative learning by doing and experimentation. And therefore, basically, the bigger you are, the more chances you have to make progress. And that's where China is leading, because its population, in particular, its advanced sectors, are so much larger than Europe. At some point in early modern Europe, there is a slow transition when invention starts to depend more and more on what I've called useful knowledge. Whether reliable or not is a question we can debate later, which is gathered through observation, experimentation, and computation, scientific or not scientific, by a small minority of specialists. Okay, and that knowledge is then converted through various channels into technology. And that is essentially what we call the upper tail human capital, or UTHC hypothesis. And so by Lin's logic, as I said, China would remain a leader as long as technological progress was of the first kind, but it starts to lose its advantage in the knowledge-based type of innovation driven by UTHC. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we see a divergence in knowledge formation, not just technological knowledge in sort of machinery, but all kind of other things, medicine, navigation, and so on and so forth. But that Lin's argument, of course, is missing a critical component, because it doesn't tell you why China did not have the innovative elite of scientists and so on that eventually drove the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And so we need to dig a little bit deeper into what drove the intellectual and technological innovation in the past. And so was there an intellectual divergence? And so what I'm submitting to you is that intellectual divergence has institutional roots which we can identify. And in Europe, in somewhere between Columbus and the death of Isaac Newton, a unique set of circumstances created a set of institutions that encouraged and incentivized intellectual innovations by an educated elite. And these institutions underlay highly competitive markets for ideas that was much more functional at creating, among other things, technological and scientific progress than elsewhere. It also created many other things that are not technological and scientific, philosophical, mathematical, and so on and so forth. But what emerges in Europe after 1500 is a competitive market for ideas. And the reason is that in Europe, technological progress always had been and remained for many, until deep into the 20th century, the responsibility of the private sector. And the way it works is engineers and doctors and natural philosophers basically working on their own, that are seeking patronage from rulers and wealthy patrons, of course, but they're rarely government bureaucrats, unlike China, where Chinese mandarins were often the drivers of technological progress. And so these people have far more freedom to think outside the box and contest conventional wisdom. And as it turned out to be much more creative and innovative. This is a competitive market, ladies and gentlemen. And in a competitive market, in ideas ensures intellectual pluralism and eventually, I strongly believe, progress. In China, on the other hand, much of the useful knowledge was created when it was created, and it was by the state and disseminated by the state. So here are some examples. I could give you more if you wanted, but you all know this. China has actually an official bureau of astronomy that's established as early as the 3rd century BC. Much of the great rice revolution by introducing Champa varieties were introduced by imperial officials, and the great encyclopedias on agricultural handbooks like Wang Zheng's and Zhu Guangxi's were all written by government bureaucrats. Now, as state capacity in China declines and the imperial government becomes more conservative, I would say reactionary, and inward-looking under Qing, technological dynamism in China withers away. And so there's some consequences to that, and I move on to the next one. One consequence, which actually some people in Washington may want to think about a little bit more, is that China that never involved intellectual property rights. There's a lovely little book by a man called Alford in 1995, something called To Steal a Book is a Gentleman's Act, or something along those lines. But it's very clever, and it makes a point that we all knew, which is Europe developed intellectual property rights in early modern times, and China really doesn't have them until the last 20 or 30 years, really, which is something worth thinking about. Another consequence, which is more sort of obvious perhaps, is that in Europe the attempts by reactionary elements, and God knows they were everywhere, not just in the Catholic world, just as much in the Protestant world, but reactionary elements, whether they're secular or religious, which tried to fight new ideas as heresy, in the end failed. And they failed because of the absence of a centralized government and the consequent coordination failures that came with it. All right. Now I want to talk about a different divergence. And this is really what the book I'm doing with Avner and Guido is about. And so a number of recent scholars have recently pointed to a remarkable gap that's opened between Europe and the rest of the world at some point in the Middle Ages. And that is Jack Goody's and many other scholars' discovery that medieval Europe started to organize increasingly by nuclear families. And quantitatively inclined social scientists have recently put a lot of stress on this. So this is a book that is coming out by a friend of mine, Joe Henrik at Harvard. Joe is a quantitative anthropologist, and of course this is a very nice catchphrase, right? So it's the rise of weird people. Now weird, what's weird mean? Weird mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And basically, and the subtitle says it all, how Westerners became psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous. And so this has many dimensions. The two most important ones are first, that Europe is abandoning the extended family or the clan. And in part as a consequence of what we see this, the high now demographic pattern by which Europeans married later and therefore curbed, at least to some extent, their fertility rates. Now, many scholars, including Jack Goody, but also Avner Greif, Jonathan Schultz, a young scholar who's just finished his degree, and many have pointed to the role of the Latin Church in bringing this about. And this church worked very hard to promote nuclear families. Now, as an unintended consequence of this, what you see happening in Europe is that society is organized by groups of people who are united by a common interest and not by common ancestry. And so Avner calls these units corporations, and they include the things we all know and love about medieval Europe: monasteries, guilds, universities, independent cities and commune cities, friendly societies, and so on and on. And eventually, of course, it leads to business corporations, which still retains the name. But in medieval Europe, really, these are all kind of voluntary organizations of people who are not related. Now, China, of course, moves in the opposite direction for a variety of reasons. Some of may have to do with the introduction of the quick ripening rice. Other reasons may be quite ideological, and that had Neo-Confucian resurgence in the Song dynasty, emphasized loyalty to the clan far more than, say, a few centuries before. So, Ju Chi's most remembered books is, in fact, the Family Rituals book, which is a very good description of how clans should behave toward another. What is not fully realized until Joe Henrich and Jonathan Schultz pointed this out in great detail is that there's a great deal of contemporary evidence that people who grow up in large extended families, that these groups foster limited as opposed to general trust, that they enhance conformism, suppress original thinking, and entrepreneurial behavior. Now, why that exactly is something we could debate, but here the data speak, and the evidence that Joe Henrich has amassed to show that in societies based on extended families, there is a great deal of difference in these many dimensions that seems to be quite convincing. All right, now, political divergence. Since 1279, when China was united by the Mongol armies of Kublai Khan, it remained a single political entity. Europe, as Walter Scheidel has recently reminded us in the book forthcoming, which I already advertised to a few people here, and he and another paper, quite an ingenious paper by Kokoyama and Sen, published last year, explain a little bit why we may think of China remaining unified and Europe splintering. And so until about 500 AD, Walter Scheidel points out, China and Europe had followed very roughly converging political paths, and that the political divergence really only starts after the fall of Rome. Now, I think a lot of people would stress, and this goes back all the way to Edward Gibbon and Immanuel Kant and David Hume, that you cannot understand European political and economic history without stressing the fragmentation, in which not just nation states, but autonomous communes, city-states, religious entities, all kind of groups constantly compete with one another for power, for resources, and prestige. And this has all kind of important consequences. One of them is growing fiscal capacity of the states and of the cities and of the other units, and the ability of authorities to coordinate internal economic activity, enforce contracts, and resolve disputes, so serve as a third-party enforcer of contracts. It's also, and this takes me back to what I said earlier, it's the absence of any kind of monopolies in the market for ideas, which actually goes back to the Middle Ages, but the Middle Ages still has the Latin Church as at least one form of monopoly, and that's gone with the Reformation, so competition is everywhere, and as a result, heterodoxies can flourish and innovation can happen everywhere because intellectuals are mobile and footloose and nobody can tell them what to do. Never forget that Hobbes' Leviathan was written in Paris and John Locke's Essays on Toleration were written in Amsterdam, but the Dutch themselves were as tolerant because the great Dutch Hugo Grotius, as every Dutch schoolboy knows, was smuggled out in a bookcase from prison and spent the rest of his life in Paris. So, people moved around and everybody knew that they could move around. As a result, suppression of new ideas becomes ineffective. All right. Now, state capacity. Another reversal. China was a despotic state, but to use a phrase I've just borrowed from the new book by Asamoah and Robinson, it was despotism on the cheap. Because, as you'll see in a minute, the ability of the Chinese state to extract resources from the population is very, very poor. So, 11th century, China was ruled by the most formidable empire in the world. It had 100 million people. It had probably over 1 million soldiers. Nothing remotely like that existed in Europe that once had been part of Rome. So this is the revenues as a fraction of GDP. God knows how approximate they are. But look, here there are the numbers are just orders of magnitude. This is China in 1086. This is Iraq under the Abbasids. And this is England and France in the sort of high Middle Ages. I mean, these are obviously states that have very low fiscal capacity. Now, this is a few centuries later. Look at the difference. So early Meiji Japan still extracts a lot, but here's England, France, the US, Ottoman Empire. Here's Qing China. I mean, they go from the top of the pyramid to the very bottom.
Is it 1900 or
1800?
It's an early beginning for Meiji, but.
Excuse me? I know, the early Meiji. So
What on the making?
it's circa 1800. Okay, so hey, come on, 1868. Fair enough. Yeah, I'm actually done before. So this is really a truly big reversal in which state capacity. Now, Patrick and I disagree exactly on the significance on state capacity. I go back and forth on it. On a good day, I will actually recognize that the state did lots of good things, including, of course, law and order, protected against foreigners, contract resolution. On a bad day, I think of the European state as a bunch of rent seekers and predators who stole everybody's money so that they could have young men killed in useless battles. So, I'm still not quite sure how to think of the state, but the data speak here. So, for good or for bad, Larry Epstein thought it was a great thing. Lots of people think it was not such a great thing. But, Charles Tilly may well have been right. Maybe this is what made the state, and maybe the state, after all, was not such a bad thing. Finally, urbanization. So there, too, is a great divergence. Now, it's very hard to actually measure the degree of urbanization. As you know, probably, lots of economists have used the proportion people living in cities as a proxy for GDP or for other things, because there's some rough correlation between urbanization and economic development. And so the data really are hard to interpret, because in European context, actually cities are fairly well defined, because almost every city is walled, and so you know who lives in the city and who doesn't. In China, most of the cities, as Li Bozhong has argued, among others, tend to be much more sort of spread out, and it's not clear where the city exactly ends and where the countryside begins. And so we may have been understating Chinese urbanization. That said, here are some numbers for you. This is the percentage population living in city, and these are the left column is cities over 10,000 people, and on the right people over 40,000 people, and you can see that in the year 1000, basically urbanization in Europe is negligible, and you can see it going up over the next decade. And in China, it doesn't fall. I mean, I don't know. That's probably the best you can say about these numbers. But it doesn't rise either. And so once more, you have a great reversal in urbanization. Now, urbanization is a consequence of, to some extent, of economic development, commercialization, and so I'm not sure industrialization, but commercialization for sure. And it has consequences, of course, because within cities, it's where the intellectual, the technological, the scientific activity is taking place. So as more and more Europeans live in cities, clearly these cities are producing the kind of useful knowledge that eventually, erupts into the Industrial Revolution. So I'm basically done. There are many great diversions on many dimensions, and they interacted and affected one another in many ways. And I think the task for the next generation of scholars is try to start to disentangle these interactions. But the most important moral, I think, and here I'm sort of trying to take a little bit of a step away from the details, okay? And that is that it's very important to remember, and this is very much against people like David Landis, my friend and teacher, but I think he's wrong about this. And that is that there was nothing historically inevitable about everything which I have shown you. And we shouldn't really think about the divergences and the reversal as sort of deep and inexorable factors baked in European and Chinese geography and location, inspired by monotheistic religion, whatever that exactly means, or harking back to ancient history and the classical legacy of Greece and Rome. Instead, I think it's much more fruitful to think about what happened as an age in which a number of contingent, if not quite accidental, but contingent factors came together in European cultural development and launched a unique and unlikely historical dynamic, which was peculiar to Europe. And they didn't do so for anybody else. Thank you.